We've had a nice break. We found our zen. Okay. Part of the brain, medulla oblongata. Perhaps it's new to you. Perhaps it's not. Medulla oblongata does a lot for your body. What does it do for you with the perspective of your cardiovascular system? It has a few nuclei in it. What's a nucleus? Don't say an organelle. When we're talking about parts of the brain and we say nuclei, we are referring to a collection of cell bodies that have a common function. So there are a few nuclei in the medulla oblongata I want you to revisit. Maybe you've learned about them from anatomy. The medulla oblongata has a cardioacceleratory center. It also has a cardioinhibitory center, or nucleus. It also has a vasomotor center, or nucleus. What do you think the cardioacceleratory center is going to do? Chronotropy goes up. Cardioinhibitory center. Heart rate goes down. Okay, now how do we actually officially describe those cardioacceleratory or cardioinhibitory centers gaining more control? Now listen to this. If the cardioacceleratory center is stimulated or activated, what will happen to heart rate? It goes up. If the cardioinhibitory center is activated, what will happen to heart rate? Doesn't that sound a little weird to you?
No.
No? Okay, good. You're like, after today, the first half of the lecture? That's easy. Vasomotor center. If it's stimulated, I want you to think more squeeze on the blood. Particularly, I want you to think of the veins getting more squeeze and more blood returning to the heart, venous return going up, cardiac output going up.
So this slide, is that all medulla oblongata?
Yes.
Can you repeat the vasomotor, more squeeze?
Vasomotor is going to adjust the resistance. It's going to adjust it through the sympathetic nervous system. It's easy for us to think about arterials. That's what we mostly think of when we think of vasoconstriction. But I also don't want us to forget about the veins, because they have a tunica media and they are innervated too. So think about you in a sympathetic moment during exercise maybe. I want you not only to think of your peripheral resistance going up and your pressure going up, but in a sympathetic moment you also have more pressure being applied on the veins.
When you say increase the squeeze on the blood, were you referring to the cardioacceleratory or the inhibitory?
Cardioacceleratory and inhibitory have nothing to do with blood vessels. Vasomotor. So vasomotor activity, which autonomic system has the most control over the radius of your blood vessels? Sympathetic. All right, so here's a picture showing you how the medulla oblongata, through its vasomotor center, can increase the vasomotor activity of your blood vessels. Even at rest and digesting, your calm moments, you do have sympathetic tone. I'll remind you from Unit 2, I asked you, when is your sympathetic nervous system on? And I trained you to say all the time. It's just a matter of which division has more control and when. So at any given moment, you have sympathetic tone targeting the alpha receptor with norepinephrine, neurotransmitter, causing a partial vasoconstriction. If you have changes in sympathetic tone, where the sympathetic nervous system gets more active, then we would have more norepinephrine released on those alpha-1 receptors, and we get more vasoconstriction. If we have reduced sympathetic activity, then that means less norepinephrine released, and that means the tunica media would relax, and we get vasodilation. So norepinephrine is being used in this example, so we don't have to mess with those alpha 1, beta 2 fights, right? This is a much clearer approach. Good, let's focus on that one. If there's more sympathetic tone, more vasoconstriction. If there's less sympathetic tone, more vasodilation. Are you okay with that? Blood vessels that are innervated, muscular arteries certainly are. Arterioles certainly are. Capillary beds are not innervated, much too tiny, and we don't want to change their radius, unnecessary. Veins are also innervated. So they have a tunica media that can be stimulated to contract, and that can put more pressure on the blood inside, and that can help promote more venous return. Are you okay with that? Okay. Baroreceptors. Baroreceptors, as you learned in lab today, and I should be able to pick up the pace a little bit for these few slides, are found in the aortic arch and carotid sinuses. We recognize that they are spray-type receptors. They are pressure receptors. They are constantly giving information through their afferent fibers. These are fibers carrying action potentials up to the brain. They are always starting those action potentials. The brain, the medulla oblongata, is simply monitoring how many of those action potentials are coming in a given amount of time. If there's higher blood pressure and more stretch, then there are more action potentials going up to the brain. The resulting output will be more parasympathetic in nature. If blood pressure drops and there's less pressure on the baroreceptors, then there will be fewer action potentials up to the brain, and the resulting output to the heart will be a sympathetic response.
Is it kind of like a positive feedback? When you increase one, you increase the
This is negative feedback.
It is? So less.
Decreased pressure leads to increased sympathetic response.
I'm thinking action potential is set.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So if you want to think of it that, we're talking about a reflex arc, you're only picking the starting point. You're not getting to the ending point. So go through the whole thing, and then you'll see it's a negative feedback response. Because if it were a positive feedback response, we'd get more pressure leading to more pressure, leading to more pressure, instead of the reverse. Chris.
So more action potentials are going to be sent to lower your heart rate, correct?
Start that again and be more complete.
Well,
What starts the action potentials?
stimulating the baroreceptors.
And what stimulates them?
High blood pressure.
Okay. And how can we get high blood pressure in those areas of the aortic arch and carotid sinus?
How do you get sympathetic? Increase the exercise.
Okay, not even just right now. Your heart is contracting, right? So if your heart suddenly contracted, you're not exercising, but it contracted with greater vigor, all of a sudden your aortic baroreceptors and carotid sinus would detect more blood volume, more stretch, more pressure, right? More action potentials would go up to the brain. The resulting output would be parasympathetic. Correct.
I was just wondering, this was a question we were talking about yesterday in that English class. And it was something with the action potentials lowering here.
So the more action potential sent up because your pressure is too high, the corrective mechanism should be more parasympathetic, less sympathetic, which means chronotropy and inotropy drop because we're not having as much sympathetic tone. So that means the cardio inhibitory center is stimulated in that case. If your blood pressure drops, Less pressure means less stretch and fewer action potentials up to the medulla oblongata. The corrective action will be more sympathetic outflow. So the cardioexcellatory center and vasomotor center will be stimulated. Does that make sense? So how did they actually determine, well, no, I'm not going to go. They played with dogs for this. Oh yeah, here's the gross morbid experiment that they did. How they tested this response is they actually, on dogs, they anesthetized. Dogs were used all the time, and you know what? Most of the time the scientists would use their own pets. So they were very gentle to their own pets. Next week I'll tell you about Goldblatt's hypertension, and he had so little money for his scientific experiments that he used his own dog. I have a picture of him with his dog. Like removed his kidney to test on him. But he loved him. I'm saying that even though we may do experiments on animals, we still do take care. I mean, we talk to them, we feed them, we stay with them. Until we, euthanize them and chop them up for parts, yes. All right. Side note, can I just tell you what happened when I killed my first mouse? Well, I was so nervous because I wanted to do it swiftly so that the animal would not, experience hardly any pain. Because it's a mouse, right? Musculus, who cares? Anyway, so I remember taking the mouse out of the cage. I'm holding it by the tail. And I'm being told what to do, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this fast. I'm going to be as humane as possible. And mice have a grasping reflex, so when you hold them by their tail, you can hold them over their cage, and we have a wire grate that we have to hold their food that you've seen at the pet stores. So you hold the mouse over, and they'll grab onto that cage. Well, if you keep them suspended by holding their tail, you can stretch them, right? So then you take something like, okay, don't judge me yet. You take scissors, but closed. See, you're judging. Closed. But you can use anything that's, you can even use a pencil if you wanted to. So then you take your closed scissors and you put it at the base of their neck, and you yank the tail really quickly. You're like hanging them. That's how you're doing cervical dislocation, right? It's like them dropping through the trap. So here I am, so nervous, and I'm stretching them like this. I get my scissors, and I'm like, okay. I feel like I'm an American Indian where I have to pray over the animal and say thank you for giving me this blessing. I will use you. And okay, so 1, 2, 3, and I pushed the head just free and clear. I didn't mean to. I'm so nervous. Blood was everywhere.
Wonder what your professor said, or
Well, my professor didn't see that, but the other graduate student, Dr. Zoe, was there, and he had mouse blood. And I believe his response was, in his broken Chinese English, I do it. All right, so getting to the vagus nerve. So the way they tested this, they actually put constrictors on, not the vagus nerve, they put it on the common carotid so that the downstream carotid sinuses with their baroreceptors were getting less blood arriving. So that means less pressure. And it turns out when they put on those clamps, what they saw was the output from the medulla oblongata was to increase sympathetic output. And so arterial pressure went up. Why? The heart started to beat with greater force of contraction. Chronotropy and inotropy went up. but also there was more vasomotor activity systemically in that animal. And so their mean arterial pressure rose just from those 2 clamps there. All right? So once they released the clamps and the blood was able to go back to the carotid sinus, there was more blood volume, more blood pressure, more degree of stretch, more action potentials. The resulting output command was less sympathetic, more parasympathetic. So the cardio inhibitory center gained more control. The vasomotor center and cardio-acceleratory center lost their control. You okay with that? Mackenzie's not?
I just was wondering, there's baroreceptors in the aorta as well as the carotid, so if there was a signal cut, well not cut, but hinged between the 2 of them and the medulla oblongata is receiving info from the aorta says it's fine, or even it's increasing because it's getting backed up, and then the carotid doesn't have anything, how would it figure out which one to listen to?
Okay, so let's do sheer numbers. How about that? How many carotid sinuses do you have? How many aortic arches? Okay, that was an easy fix. Whether or not that actually transcends, are there fewer spray receptors in the carotid sinuses and more in aortic arch, and therefore that math wouldn't apply? No, but I can tell you the experiments, even though the aortic arch was still intact, by clamping the common carotid, we did see this phenomenon. So that's why I said, let's just think in sheer numbers. 2 versus 1. We win. All right. Baroreceptors are really important for you from going from a reclined position to a standing or sitting position. They are saving you from fainting and hitting the floor. So as you stand up, about 500 to 700 milliliters of your